Good afternoon, good evening, مساء الخير, and even good morning. I see the number of participants rising, and I know from people that subscribe that we're going to be joined by all continents. Welcome everyone. للمستمعين يلي بيحبوا يسمعوا بالعربي فيكم تغيروا القناة في زر تحت على اليمين مكتوب عليه interpretation. إذا بتكبسوه بتسمعوا الحديث في العربي، وفيكم كمان تسألوا الأسئلة في العربي وكمان بنجاوبكم في العربي. This is a two-language meeting. It's going to be simultaneously in Arabic and in English. So welcome everyone to Tax Policy in Lebanon, Past, Current, and Future. This is part of the Reimagining Lebanon series that the Arab Reform Initiative is developing. It's the third part, and there will be several others in the future. We're very happy that this particular meeting is co-sponsored by ALDIC, and I will present ALDIC in a moment, and also by my observatory of the political economy of the Middle East at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. So we have a wonderful panel for you today to debate this issue, the issue of tax policy, which is typically not thought of as a very exciting issue. But it's really a testimony, I think, to the intellectual curiosity that was started with the Thawra in Lebanon, that many among us Lebanese, friends of Lebanon, are trying to think hard about how to solve the current crisis and also how to build a more prosperous and just society for the future. And for both aspects, dealing with the short-term problem and building a more socially just and also more productive economy, the question of fiscal policy, tax policy is quite crucial. And so, as I said, we have a top panel today that will help us think about these issues, both in the short term and in the long term. Before I introduce them, let me just say a few words about how this hour and a half will be organized. So we will start with our three speakers. Each will talk for 10-15 minutes, and that will give us plenty of time to interact and to hear your questions, which you will type on the panel, and I will summarize them. I think this will be the easiest way to aggregate the questions. Some of you are also following on Facebook, and you can also send your comments on Facebook, and I will be seeing them here. I should also say before we start that Miss Sarah is translating this, so thank you, Sarah, for the hard work you'll be doing, and I'm sure there will be quite a few technical words. Let me introduce our panel in the order of appearance. So we have first Alain Bifani that will speak. Alain is a top and well-known Lebanese economist. He's also very well known for having been the former Director General of Finance at the Ministry of Finance in Lebanon, until a couple of months ago, where he left in protest against the fact that there were very little reforms happening in spite of the huge crisis in which Lebanon is. Alain will be followed by Lydia Asouad. Lydia is a PhD candidate, but an up-and-coming rising star that has already done wonderfully original work on the tax system in Lebanon and on inequality in Lebanon in particular. And she will give us a sense of inequality and how it's related to taxation. And finally, but not finally, we have met Karim here with us. We're very happy to have you. Karim is an attorney at law, a specialist of the fiscal system in Lebanon. He's the president of ALDIC, which is the Lebanese Association for Taxpayers' Rights. And he's also a member of several international panels, including the UN FACTI panel on taxation. And so I should introduce myself. I'm Asouad Diwan. I'm a professor of economics, now teaching at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. So without further ado, let's get started. I have asked Alain to help us think about the current situation and the short term in particular. Lebanon is in crisis. The fiscal deficits are probably rising. You'll tell us more about it. Clearly, there will be a big challenge in the future in the short term to cut expenditure or to increase taxation or both. This will be painful given the recession that the country is living. So tell us more about the past performance, what we learned from it, the state of the deficit and of the budget right now, and also what measures are feasible in the short term to deal with the problem. Should we tax more, broaden the tax base? What would you recommend? Alain, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Asouad. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Let me go very broadly into the situation and the figures. Lebanon, as you know, has been managed in an awkward manner since the 90s. Instead of tightening the belt to absorb the impact of the war, revenues were systematically lowered until bankruptcy was practically announced in 2002, just before the Paris II conference. This is when the government finally accepted to introduce the VAT that my team had prepared when George Karim was Minister of Finance. Starting in 2002, the tax burden started increasing. VAT alone was about 4% of GDP. But we made it a point at that time to reduce its regressive impact by widening the exemptions to all necessities. And I had also started revitalizing the salary and wage tax, which was not opposed by politicians, and tried to do the same with the tax on capital gains made abroad. And that one was unsurprisingly harshly opposed by them. Now we reached a bracket of tax revenue between 15 to 18% of GDP. And despite the weird ideology in place in governments and parliaments persistently working against their tax administration, there was an average improvement of about 3% on a yearly basis, only due to the tax administration's efforts, as no legal measures were taken to close the tax gap. The improvement continued until the last 2 years when the whole system started to collapse, as you know. In 2019, until end July, tax revenue was 8,372 billion Lebanese pounds, up from 88 billion on 31/7/2018. For the same period in 2020, it dropped to 6,075 billion, which is a drop of 27.4%. Also due to the measures related to COVID, which allow taxpayers to defer their payments till the end of the year. But if income tax fell from 3,758 to 2,987, VAT dropped from 2,235 to 1,001. And customs and excise fell from 1,129 to 756 billion. And this reflects obviously the massive adjustments in imports that is taking place after the banking crisis and its consequences. Non-tax revenue followed a similar path, falling from 1,695 to 1,113 during the same period, with the usual volatility, of course, introduced by the irregular payments from telecom. The primary fiscal deficit strongly deteriorated. It was positive 870 last year. It is now minus 1,066 at end July, although payments decreased significantly. Interest payments are still at around 2,000 billion, down from 4,300 billion. But because it doesn't seem that the central bank is totally committed to the deal that it struck with the previous government, while payments on the Eurobonds stopped. As for the expenditure structure, it has continued to stiffen, with a large share in salaries, transfers, and debt servicing. You asked me to comment a little bit on the IMF approach. I think that at this stage, the IMF, in case of a program, will certainly want to adopt an approach that will get Lebanon out of this terrible spiral. The fund has made it clear on several occasions, and again a few days ago, that the government plan that was produced a few months ago is by far the best base to start. But given the vested interests in the system and the big ability of the most corrupt elements in the society to sabotage any plan that would have those who benefit most from the system contribute in bearing the losses, it seems that this approach will be difficult to pursue and that the policy of doing nothing will prevail, which will result in throwing tens of billions of dollars of losses on the shoulders of the Lebanese citizens and on stealing depositors' money to the last penny. That, by the way, is precisely why I quit. Nevertheless, even if the IMF will have as top priorities the restructuring of the central bank and the banking sector, capital controls, banking resolution law, there will have to be a significant part on the fiscal, as was the case in the government plan. Obviously, a big effort is long overdue on transfers, namely to EDL, on the size of the public sector, which is the real problem, not only the salaries of certain groups, but it's also the size that is a problem, and on political spending. Now, on the revenue side, I have my areas of agreement and disagreement with the fund. Where the IMF believes that quick money needs to come from massive increase, for instance, in VAT rates, I personally do not favor increasing the burden on those who are already contributing. And let me say from the beginning that increasing the tax rate on so-called luxury items, for instance, is not only useless and populistic, but it also further increases, its further increase would contradict the aim of making Lebanon touristically attractive again. My recommendations on the revenue would quickly and broadly be as follows. First, balance the burden among the three pillars, which are consumption, revenue, and wealth. There is too much on consumption and practically nothing on wealth. Reduce the regressive impact of each and every existing taxes, like I did for VAT when we introduced it. Rely on taxes that do not depend on the local situation, such as, obviously, the residence income tax on capital gains generated abroad. And use the CRS, the Tax Exchange of Information System, that we strived so hard to have Lebanon become part of. And we succeeded against the will of everybody. Throughout the 8-year exercise, not one minister or MP was in favor, not even bankers or independent professions were supportive. But we did it against everybody's will. And now it is there. It is a very important tool to be used. By the way, some ministers were making it a point to sabotage everything we were doing on this front and oppose the requested laws and measures. So it's now time to optimize the use of this tool. Obviously, we would also urge the government into the base erosion and profit shifting process. And another item would be, I think, to rely on green taxes. It's a good income. It improves the environment. It's good for tourism and the health bill. And we can also introduce smart green tax breaks. And I proposed a project that is ready to pass. It is at the ministry nowadays. We have to rebalance the tax system between rent and labor investment. I was the one who fought for the introduction of the tax on interest rates, 5%, then 7%, but it remains below the 10% on dividends. I was also the one who taxed the individuals on real estate capital gains, but it remains too low compared to the existing taxes on labor and production. We don't want to push people to rent. Then obviously there is the elephant in the room, banking secrecy. The world has changed and it has become useless in making Lebanon more attractive as no significant inflows remain. It's obviously bad for income tax, especially independent professions, for inheritance tax, and it is an obstacle to collect capital gains tax from abroad. let alone that it introduces unfairness and encourages hot money, which is the last thing we need now. To be noted, when I officially requested the profits made by the banks from financial engineering operations for tax purposes, the answer of the central bank was, there is banking secrecy. Can you imagine that it was given on government's money? The government wants to know what happened with its own money, and there is banking secrecy that applies. On another topic, we obviously have to force customs to be very serious in border controls and custom revenue, excise and VAT collection at borders. This will not only significantly increase revenue, but it will also introduce fairness in the system, proper competition, which is extremely important, knowing that competition is totally biased in the economy, and it is, of course, a very bad element for the economy long term. We can envisage a wealth tax. We tried a windfall tax for the financial engineering profits. It didn't work. But it has to take into consideration the wealth sent or smuggled abroad if it wasn't properly taxed, as well as various assets. Nowadays, bankers are making it clear that they favor this against admitting that they are imposing haircuts on their depositors. Another point is that the currency rate used by tax and customs authorities remain at 1508, the lowest of the 6 rates on the market. And this, of course, has to be, amended one way or another. Now, tax expenditures should be reduced too, and we can talk about that in details if you're interested. Also, tax breaks are given too widely, and most of them are there to accommodate the happy few. On top of that, the military, which is a huge number of people, and judges and religious groups benefit from enormous exemptions. Also, big amounts are also taken from tax revenue to be given to private professional associations. So the tax base needs to expand toward the biggest fish, as compliance is extremely low for the wealthiest. In parallel, efforts should continue for the small taxpayers, mainly to educate them and improve compliance, especially in the regions. By the way, we totally changed the way the tax authorities operate by moving into risk analysis, a compliance-based approach, introducing the tax identification number, desk auditing, and a function-based administration organization. These efforts successfully led to major improvements, but the process has to continue, and systems and softwares have to be widely used. Of course, non-supportive ministers did and can delay this forever. Same for electronic taxation and payments. As you know, we have a system that works quite well. But when I resigned, we were moving toward blockchain and the use of artificial intelligence for compliance, and this should continue. Information sources are not always good. They have to be improved. We have obvious sources such as the Social Security Fund, such as customs or security forces, who either refuse to provide information or provide incomplete ones. This underlines the dismantlement of the state, where every block works on its own. And on non-tax revenue, mainly telecom, privatization, if it happens, is definitely no option today, as long as Lebanon is bankrupt. Nevertheless, if at some point down the road it does happen, most of the telecom revenue is of tax origin anyway, and shouldn't be directly impacted. As regards very practical measures if you want to conclude, collection remains a major issue. Nothing helps. Banking secrecy doesn't, corruption, politicians and their interferences, judges and the way they handle oppositions. If we have time, I can tell you what happened with the VAT carousel when we uncovered it. And there is no stick in the legal framework. If a taxpayer doesn't pay, not much can be done to enforce payment. Every time we tried to amend the procedures to help enforce law and compliance, politicians and lobbies have torpedoed that. We actually tried 22 times in 20 years to introduce many amendments, and we wanted to remain soft and fair. I personally introduced penalties to be paid by the administration if the files are not treated within deadlines, in order to be fair. So of course, soft compliance is needed, but definitely no more amnesties because of their devastating effects on compliance and their unfairness. We can bring taxpayers into the system without penalties. And we have specific cases here. Namely, we did it for salary and wages taxes and so on. And that is more than enough. There is no need to go toward a total disruption in the system. And one word to finish, the wealthiest are in charge, and law and compliance do not apply to them. And they do not really care about common good. And this is basically what should change. Thank you.
Thank you, Alain. You put a lot on the table about the current situation, how things have changed over the years, and the need for major reforms in terms of enlarging the base, improving the system, the collections, removing exemptions, and mostly rebalancing towards where the wealth is. We're going to hear a little bit more from Lydia about inequality now. We have the elections in the US tomorrow, and really the main debate, if there is a debate besides COVID, is on taxation. Biden is proposing to increase taxation, to reverse tax Trump's tax cuts in order to invest in growth and in infrastructure. And so clearly the role of fiscal policy in affecting inequality in a country is very important. So I've asked Lydia to tell us first about what she knows about inequality in Lebanon, how big it is, what type of inequality, to what extent has fiscal policy helped or hindered, and compared to other countries, what seems feasible. Lydia.
Thank you very much, Ishaq, for the very kind introduction. And thanks again to the Arab Reform Initiative for organizing this webinar and for inviting me. It's really a great honor to be here. So my name is Lydia Asouad. I am a PhD candidate in economics at the Paris School of Economics, as Ishaq said, and a research fellow at the World Inequality Lab, where my research focuses on income and wealth inequality in the MENA region, and in particular in Lebanon. And today, my talk, let me move the slide. My talk will be divided into three main parts. So first, I will present results from my research and establish key facts on income and wealth inequality in Lebanon between 2005 and 2016, so before the current crisis. Then I will try to explain how the fiscal system contributed to those extreme levels of income inequality. And then I will propose some fiscal and tax reform possible to increase social justice. That could be a concrete first step to any economic reform package. So on the first part about the distribution of income and wealth inequality in Lebanon. So in my research, I combine in a systematic manner all data sources on income that exist for Lebanon, survey data, national accounts, government finance reports published by the Ministry of Finance, and most importantly, micro-fiscal data that actually Alain Bifani very generously shared with me. So without this data, this paper would not have been possible. So thank you again for this.
Pleasure.
And the results are really striking, as you can see in this first figure. So between 2005 and 2016, the top 10% richest individuals in Lebanon received almost 55%, 54% of the total national income. The middle 40% of the distribution, you can think about it as the middle class, basically, receives 34% of total national income, according to these estimates. And finally, the bottom 50%, the half poorest individual received less than 12% of total national income. So it's really important to emphasize that, that Lebanon is among the most unequal countries in the world with these results. So here you can see in black the evolution of the top 1% income share for Lebanon, that is almost equal to 25% of the total national income. So almost a quarter of all national income goes to the top 1%. But most interestingly, you can see that Lebanon is among the countries with the highest inequality in the world, like below Brazil, with below South Africa, but otherwise more unequal than Russia, than the United States, than Colombia, etc. So really, in terms of distribution, Lebanon is exceptional. But what is really important to understand is that this unequal distribution translates into an extreme social polarization. So what do I mean by this? Well, basically, you really have everything going to the top 10 and nothing for the middle class and the rest of the population, as you can see, which is not necessarily necessary when you have high inequality. For an example, in the US, you see that there are relatively high levels of inequality, but the middle 40%, the middle class, have approximately the same as the top 10%. And in most European countries, the middle class have more than the top 10%. In Lebanon, really, the poor, and that's true in terms of sharing of the total national income, but also in terms of levels of income, the poorest are as poor as their counterparts in poor or developing countries, such as India. And the richest individuals are as rich or even richer as their counterparts in rich countries, such as France and the United States. So it's really highly polarized. And this even before the current crisis. So now, if we move to wealth, so there are even less data sources with regard to wealth, but the rich list published by magazines such as Forbes or Arabian Business magazine can give us some idea about the weight of the richest. And here I simply computed a metric, which is the billionaire's wealth as share of the national income, the average since 1990. And as you can see, the billionaire's wealth in Lebanon represent almost 30% of the total national income, compared, for an example, to less than 10% for the USA, or less than 15% for Russia. So the weight of the billionaires suggests that wealth inequality is extremely high in Lebanon as well. And indeed, if we use this weight with some simple assumptions that is available in the paper, we can see that the wealth distribution is probably very high as well in Lebanon, with the top 10% richest individual receiving almost 70% of total wealth. So, as a summary of the part one, like the result of this study shows that the distribution of economic resources in Lebanon are extremely unequal. This was the case before the current crisis. And basically, the Lebanese economic miracle, according to which Lebanon is a model of economic success in the region, is basically a legend, and for sure only benefited the top groups that largely coincide with the ruling elites and the politicians, as Alain Bifani just said. It's the wealthiest that are in power and that receives most of the benefit of the economic activity over the period. Obviously, as you all know, the current economic and financial crisis, the COVID crisis, and the Beirut blast probably increased further the social polarization and inequality levels. And that's why tackling poverty and inequality should be really a key priority in the next month and years. So now, how did the fiscal system contribute to those levels. Obviously, it's not only the fiscal system that explained that, but it played a role. So here, first, you can see the evolution of the tax revenues in Lebanon, that is the revenues the state collects through taxation over the 2005 and 2017 period. So first point to say is that the evolution, the tax revenues represent approximately 15% of the total GDP, which is quite low, as Alain Bifani said. And to give you an idea, in Chile, for an example, that had massive protests as well, it's equal to 21%. In the US, 25%. And on average for OECD countries, it's 34%. So really, Lebanon, in terms of fiscal capacity, does poorly. And most of the fiscal revenues come from the VAT in green and in taxes on international trade, so indirect taxes. So indirect taxes that are notoriously regressive and that do not depend on individuals' income. So here it's basically the same, the graph I just showed you, but I combine together the different parts of the tax system. And as you can see, the majority of taxation relies on indirect taxes. So it represents 65% of the total fiscal revenues compared, for an example, to 24% in France. Then you have taxes on income collected progressively and taxes on income collected with a flat tax rate, so that is the same no matter the income level, so mostly for interest, income, dividends, and capital gains. And finally, wealth, and mostly built property, which is also collected at a flat tax rate, and I can talk about it more later. So really, it's key to have in mind that the entire fiscal system is based on regressive taxation that affects mostly the poorest individual, as it does not depend on income level. So it represents a higher share of their income and their budget. So a second important, a third thing to have in mind is that even in terms of progressive taxation, Lebanon does poorly. So first, before going through this graph, let me recall a bit about how the personal income taxation that taxes income progressively works in Lebanon. So in Lebanon, this tax taxes income separately. So wages are taxed alone, then built property revenues are taxed alone, and then some profits are taxed separately. So profits of independent, self-employed, and individual in small corporations. And you have progressive tax rate applying to each of those incomes separately. So if you are an individual that receives several of those income, you receive a lot of built property revenues because you own houses and you're also an employee and receive wages. For the fiscal administration, you are three different persons, and the fiscal administration does not sum all your income and does not tax you on the total sum of income. So that's the first point. And then also it's super important to say, and that's what this graph shows, that the top marginal tax rates, which are the tax rates that applies to the highest income when you tax progressively, are historically and geographically very low in Lebanon. So here you can see the evolution in purple of the top tax rate applying to the highest labor income, and it's really extremely low compared to other countries in the world and reaches today 20%. So it's lower than the US and other regions, and same observation for profits. And if you want me to compare with more comparable countries, so in Latin America, etc., the same conclusion, we can reach the same conclusion. Lebanon was in orange always with the lowest rates. So even if the world in general decreased their rates, Lebanon is really outstanding and taxes little the richest. So very quickly, So Lebanon has a low fiscal capacity and collect very few revenues. So that's why the country does not have the means to undertake efficient social policies. The system relies mostly on indirect taxes that are regressive. Only a small part of the system is progressive, and it's based on a schedular system that taxes each source separately. And most capital incomes are not taxed and not taxed progressively. But the positive, like the optimist message, is that there is a large degree of maneuverability to improve this system. And finally, very quick proposal, and I'm happy to talk more detail about it in the Q&A. So a first key reform in terms of taxation is to establish a general income tax that taxes all income sources together and at progressive rates and higher progressive rates. So when I say all income, more capital income should be included, in particular interest incomes, capital gains, and dividends within those this scheme. The tax should be simplified, so it's exactly what Alain Bifani says. There are a lot of tax breaks and exemption, and Karim will tell us more about this. And it should apply to all income. Top marginal tax rate should be increased. And we should really put the burden more on direct, on income and on capital, and make the system relies mostly on direct taxation and not indirect taxation. A possibility, especially in the short run, is to also establish an exceptional wealth tax. So a 10% taxes on billionaires, if you remember how their wealth represented in terms of national income, could yield 3% of the national income. And when you have when you have billionaires, you have also millionaires. So there is a large tax base. And historically, this type of taxes have been implemented in crisis, and Lebanon is currently experiencing a huge crisis. And finally, a more comprehensive and progressive wealth tax can be implemented, in particular on real estate. And Karim will explain this in more detail. And likewise, it's very important to fight tax evasion and to increase enforcement. Tax evasion is really the Lebanese national sport, and it will be key to decrease inequality. So very quickly, just this slide, we know that the current crisis is big, and we need an entire, like the solution will be political, and we need an entire, we need to rethink the entire system and social contract. But what is key to have in mind is that inequality and poverty are the most urgent economic challenge currently, and social justice should be a key priority. People are dying today in Lebanon. And taxes can be a useful tool to increase fairness. And there is a large margin of maneuver in this field. Like Lebanon can really increase a lot in this regard. So that's a bit of optimism. And that's key to build any state that is able to last long. A state cannot survive if it cannot tax its citizens, and in particular, its wealthiest individuals. Thank you very much. I hope I did.
Thank you, Lydia. You put a lot on the table in exactly 15 minutes. This is
okay, perfect.
Excellent. So we've gone a long way. We've moved from the economist doer, Alain Bifani, that has tried to reform the system, to the economist thinker analyst, Lydia, that compared Lebanon to other countries and showed us what needs to be done, what's feasible. And now we move to the legal mind that thinks about what can actually be done on the ground legally. How to oblige people to do what they hate most in life, which is pay taxes. So Karim, what can be done? Maître Dahir, sorry. Tfaddal.
No, Karim, it's fine.
Karim.
Better. Thank you, Isha, and my thanks also to the organizers and to ARI for choosing ALDIC as a partner. It goes without saying that it is a pleasure and an honor to be invited to participate to this valuable panel. Thank you to Alain, as well for this accurate and very rich retrospective of the situation. And thank you, Lydia, as well, because you facilitated the things for me, explaining the main principles and rules in force in Lebanon. I will try to give you a quick description of the situation and submit some proposals, realistic proposals, I hope. I know that those proposals will content some of you, but will upset a lot of others. But believe me, this is the least of what we may apply as realistic solutions or realistic reforms. And Lydia has provided us with some of those proposals and those ideas that may be applied in the short term or the medium term. Let me start with a description, like I have said, a description of the situation. Let us say actually that the COVID pandemic, coupled to the twin collapse of our currency and of our banking sector, we find ourselves not only in the midst of an economic downturn and financial turmoil with severe recession and increasing inflation shifting to stagflation, but plunged into an institutional and political crisis threatening the country's existence. Urgent quick measures and actions are to be put forward and implemented in order to resolve the deep-seated macroeconomic problems, bring down the current account deficit as well as the public deficit, restore confidence and achieve debt and financial sustainability. This will necessarily entail the increase of public resources by enhancing revenue collection, strengthening tax compliance, and applying efficient and fair taxes. How, when, and by which means we can apply all those proposals and ideas. Actually, and as I have said, the priority fiscal objective of any recovery plan is to bring down the current account deficit and achieving debt and financial sustainability. The outcome of this process is to increase public resources and enhance revenue collection. In other words, strengthening tax compliance and applying efficient and fair taxes. But however, we have to warn that there are limits and cautions, because those measures should not undermine efforts to revive the national economy and finance sustainable development, because without growth, without revenues, there is no income and there is no taxes and there are no resources for the state. The solution should be provided locally first, and international community, IMF and others were very clear, and they said that aid flows will not be granted unless Lebanon strengthens its revenue raising capacity based on better designed tax system and stronger revenue institutions. For sure, the easiest way to increase revenues, not only in Lebanon, in all other fragile countries encountering the same problem than Lebanon, is to collect easy to collect taxes, such as VAT, custom duty, selective high-yield excise taxes on alcohol, on gasoline, on tobacco and other consumption products, or increased corporate taxes. But however, and Lydia highlighted this issue, those indirect taxes are regressive and very far from desired objective of fairness and equity. And they will undoubtedly lead to the same disaster and tragic outcome of the financing of salary scales 3 years ago, if you remember. The key question is how to improve effectiveness and of any new tax or tax reform, tax policy. First, and this should be the prerequisite for any new taxes or any increase of taxes, we have to apply a prior economic impact assessment. We should proceed to a prior economic impact study to hedge against the adverse effect of any inappropriate tax measure. We should also establish a yearly report. This report will trace the evolution of measures in comparison with initial projection and the observed results. Why? Because if ever those results are not as expected, they should be modified and should not last 60 years as for the incentive, the tax incentive that we will address later on. Encrypt the direct shortfalls of any measures, like the gross employment balance of payments and others. Second priority is to improve revenue collection by broadening the tax base and combating tax evasion. How? We should broaden the tax base by a gradual orientation and incorporation of the informal sector into the formal economy. Many things have been said about it, but nothing has been done, or little has been done, because there are no political willing for that. We should strengthen and enhance awareness and financial literacy in order to strengthen the tax civism fiscal. We should promote tax ethics and communication and explain to the people that we have a social contract in Lebanon and they have obligation, and if ever they apply and they comply with their obligations, tax obligation, they may ask for the counterpart. Otherwise, the state will remain as it is now. We should adopt simplified legal devices, and we should also have a social coverage for everybody. And at that moment, it will be easiest to ask people to comply with their tax obligations. We should set limits to the arbitrary discretion of tax authorities. How? Because we should improve and enforce sanction regime for those who are corrupted or those who do not want to apply any form of dialogue with the taxpayers in order to reach a consensus, an acceptable consensus between the two parties. We should tackle the several loopholes in the current tax system. We should abandon the scheduled tax, and Lydia has mentioned that. We should lift the bank secrecy, and this is an important subject matter that is at stake at the present time. We should amend the notification procedures because nobody is considered himself as duly notified here in Lebanon, and many loopholes and gaps and many non-compliance with tax obligations are imputable to these notifications. We should apply the tax identification number for each resident, whether national or foreigner. Each Lebanese, each resident in Lebanon should have a TIN. And at that moment, we may trace all the transactions that he will make. We should broadly resort to the new technology, implementing algorithms and computer interface links like data mining, as well as blockchain technology in order to highlight the flows and to pursue the recalcitrant. We should open access to the public beneficial ownership registers. This is very important because if all the person submit a declaration of what they have in the company's shares, lands, real estate, and cars and aeroplanes and others, at that moment we may see if there is a discrepancy between how they are living and what are their declared revenues. We should also simplify and improve the existing regulations and procedures concerning short tax form, fair and well-balanced procedures, efficient and fast administrative organs for conflict resolution and tax disputes. Third, we should review the fundamental of the tax system and adopt more efficient taxation. Lydia has tackled this issue, and our Lebanese fiscal system, for the time being, relies on indirect taxes and based toward rentier-based activities, despite the evolution that has been observed the last 3 years, and I think a lot thanks to Alain and his team. The current regime of scheduled tax adopted in 1959 excludes important revenues and assets from the tax base and facilitates tax evasions and tax abuse. We should adopt the general personal income tax on the whole revenues, and the tax base and this general income tax will include all revenues from any kind, whether either locally or abroad, capital gains, built property, anything and everything, wages and salary, business income and everything. And at that moment, it will be fair for everybody to pay at progressive rates the taxes. Everyone will contribute in proportion with its possibilities. Tax harmonization through the regrouping of disparate fiscal provisions in the general tax code, because we have several laws in Lebanon and all the taxpayers are lost with all those laws and the conflict provisions of those laws between each other. We should reform the law on property tax to channel revenues derived from rents to the income tax. We should amend the law on inheritance and gift tax and address the loopholes and vulnerabilities and close gaps facilitating tax abuse and fictive transactions. We should also extend the scope of the VAT to all the economic activities with lower thresholds and reorganize its rate fairly. We should impose a tax on wealth. Why? Because wealth inequality has been shown in several surveys to be higher than income inequality. We should impose an annual tax between 0.5 and 3%. Lydia has submitted 10%, but I think that for the short and medium term, I don't know if it's really feasible. On households with a net worth above a defined threshold and that on top of their income taxes. It will contribute to apportion the burden of the loss and debt value between the citizens. And this is very important when we are talking about the debt of the Lebanese state. It will as well encourage the wealthy and to dissipate their fortunes by spending the money in productive investments. We should expand the use of earmarked taxes. What are the earmarked taxes? Those taxes are taxes that apply to some harmful activities or for regularization, amnesty for some incomes, and their proceeds are dedicated for a specific objective in contradiction with the rules of the budget law, but it is accepted in France now and it is accepted in the USA and other countries. We may introduce in Lebanon a new tax on lands, on vacant houses, buildings, and lands, like the Roman Emperor Diocletian with the Jugatio Terrena, because it will encourage the person to use their lands or to rent their lands for productive activities, and we will allocate proceeds to a special fund promoting habitat and sustainable development. We may adopt also, and Alain have addressed the case of the exchange of information, and we know, everyone knows now, that for foreign movable revenues from foreign sources, there is a tax that should be paid in Lebanon. And many persons didn't know, or if they knew, they were considering that no tax would be paid because we have the bank secrecy and several other justifications. But now the Lebanese state will have the possibility to trace and to receive all the information about the reportable accounts and the statute of limitation in such kind of taxes is 5 years, but 7 years for those who never submitted a tax return. And it may cost them a lot. That's why if we proceed to regularization, I know that Alain is against this idea, but if we proceed to regularization and ask the person to pay one-time tax between 3 or 5% on the whole capital, we may affect and allocate the proceeds to the sovereign fund and dedicated deposit recovery fund mentioned in the recovery plan of the resigning government. We may address tax avoiding and profit shifting in the context of digital economy. And this is very important because nobody is thinking about it. And you know that the world became today digitalized, and digitalization turned out to be at the same time a chance to combat tax fraud and evasion and a loophole that facilitate the same. We have a harmful and unfair competition between multinational digital firms, the GAFAM, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and as well as Uber and Airbnb, with local actors and disrupting the ability of Lebanon to raise resources. In both indirect and direct taxation are affected. If you want to rent your house, you may rent your house through Airbnb, and nobody will come to you and ask you to pay any taxes, and Airbnb will have its portion of revenues. And this is a loophole and a gasp, and the same thing apply to a taxi driver driving you with Uber. He may not submit a tax return and not pay taxes. This is why this is a harmful and unfair competition with local actors. We have the BEPS inclusive framework addressing this issue and submitting several proposals. But Lebanon may proceed in the meantime, like other countries like India, like UK, on standalone basis, but in concerted manner, especially with its double taxation treaties, and apply a tax for such value where consumer resides, if the consumer resides in Lebanon, and value is created in Lebanon. Or create, like India, a taxable threshold with the allocation of profits based on fractional apportionment. The revenue generated by the development of international cooperation and exchange of information in tax matters. This is very important because we talked about it. This will derive and drain revenues to Lebanon. Finally, we will shift from counterproductive and unfair tax incentive to efficient and useful tax incentive. Generally implemented, the tax incentives are generally implemented to encourage specific economic activities and promote underdeveloped geographical areas, as well as to attract foreign direct investment. They may contribute to the balance of payments equilibrium and strengthen revenues with a view to redistribute wealth in the economy. However, in Lebanon, tax incentives have been found to be obsolete and outdated. I told you they are lasting since 60 years, and they are used and carried out in a manner which undermines the intention of the tax law. Taxpayer has misused, many taxpayers, not all the taxpayers, has misused or abused the law. The incentive must necessarily be coupled with other key factors. If you ask an investor for the foreign direct investment, what is the priority for you? He will never tell you that the taxes are my priority. He will tell you, first, the political stability. Second, the transparent and accountable public administration. Third, a flexible labor code. Fourth, the quality of the infrastructure. And fifth, an adequate dispute resolution mechanism. And all those are missing in Lebanon, as you know. The counterproductive, some example of counterproductive incentives and exception, I don't want to be to exceed the time that was imparted to me, but I will give you some example. We have the tax exemption on real estate activity, as you know. It led to a surplus, to a hub and inadaptability of the apartments and houses. The sector crisis, it led to a sector crisis with devastating effect, since the real estate sector has always been a key driver of economic growth in Lebanon. We have also the permanent exemption of educational institution. Originally, it was to combat literacy, but it led to multiplication of fake institutions and decrease of education levels. We have the permanent exemption of maritime and air transportation companies, especially for Middle East airlines. It created a monopolistic situation and unlawful competition. It is unjustified and it has led to increased travel and transport rates. We have the exemption on investment banks and medium and long-term credit banks. It's not now, but it applied for severally since 1983, and especially between 1990 and 2019, at the time where the banks were generating and deriving huge profits, and those banks were benefiting of an exemption from corporate tax 17% during the first financial year, and thereafter up to a saving of 4% of the paid up capital. We have the exemption of share transfer in Lebanon, and this is where reside all the tax abuse, because many of you know that we all used this mechanism, admit, because it was legal. It is tax avoidance, it's not tax evasion. And we used it at an optimization and tax planning. And we used it for real estate, and we brought in kind the lands and the real estates, and then we transferred the share instead of transferring the land, and we realized a profit because the transfer of share is not subject to any taxation, to the contrary of the lands, which are subject to registration fees and to betterment tax. We have also the package deal of the law number 360 on IDAL. It has been taken out of context and unfairly infringed and misused to lower tax burden. Finally, what are the well-targeted tax incentive as regulatory and simulation tool? Well-targeted tax incentive and well-selected productive activities, many are listed in McKinsey report. They should stimulate private investment and enhance productivity and growth. They should ensure efficient public investment, especially in infrastructure. They favor research and development, and we lack such research and development in Lebanon. It should attract foreign capitals, FDI, to create jobs, bring in foreign exchange and stabilize the trade and payment balance. It will develop the territory, and the financial shortfall can be offset by the increased business performance and increased revenues and consumption capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. You've put so much on the table, the two of you. I mean, Alain, Lydia, and Karim were much wiser, I think, now. We all realize there were problems, but the tax system that you've depicted is a caricature of an inefficient, unequal, leaky, regressive system. I think all the proposals that you put on the table to tax income in a progressive way, to have smarter exemptions that favor growth, the environment, social fairness, enlarging the tax base with sanctions, with the rule of law, moving taxes also not just to income, but to wealth, and to reduce them on consumption, and also how to modernize it with the GATAM and the changing technology in the world. And so we both have a critique of the past and a very clear vision on the future. And I think we have learned a whole lot. I have a whole set of questions coming. Let me start with two questions and go around that are kind of broad, and then we have more specific questions coming as well. The broad question, the first one is on politics, and it's the elephant in the room. And we've had a system that very much benefited the elites, but really benefited the elite in a very myopic way, because we have a governance system that is quite clientelistic, yet with quite a small revenue base. So it's very imbalanced in the way it governed, and this is what led to the debt crisis, to extraction of rents in the private sectors as well. And so there's been a big contradiction between the fiscal tool and the clientelistic way of governing, trying to really milk the state. And this has led to the big crisis. How do we expect the politics to adjust to a more balanced system? Can we expect, can we imagine that the current political structure may at least start the adjustment in the coming months or years, or do we have to wait for a totally different political structure before we can get into any of this? And I this is a big question, but I think each one of you may have interesting ways of thinking about it. For example, Alain, Bifani, you may have witnessed when Minister George Karim tried to introduce the income tax on the whole income, and there must have been whole discussions around it. Was there a chance of moving forward? Are there possibilities of making progress, at least in the current political situation? So that's the first type of question. The second question, and again, there are several people asking questions around this topic, has to do with long-term growth. That is, we are talking of a system that collects more taxes in a less regressive way, so therefore, as a share of income, as a share of wealth, it will hit more the entrepreneurs and the millionaires, and the billionaires will be more just. But to what extent would it actually hit and hurt growth prospects? Do you think in the way the world is evolving, Lebanon has room to improve social justice in terms of taxation without losing too much on efficiency, and maybe even gaining in efficiency by developing a growth path that's more sustainable, more just? So I want to go around, choose your question or answer both, kind of to the point, and then I'll put more questions on the table. Let's see. Alain, you want to start? We can go in the same order.
Sure, Isha. First, let me tell you that it was extremely interesting to me to listen to all of you, Lydia and Karim, and I would like to start with the first issue that you raised, which is an enormous one. Yes, the system benefited the elite in a myopic way, I agree. Having said so, it's important to see how the elite reacts and what kind of setup there is in their minds. We're not here in a system where if you are accused of wrongdoing, you are ousted by democratic elections or anything like that. You have elites that know that whatever happens, they are coming back, that whether they succeed or they fail in this system, they still have a place, in whichever cabinet or government or parliament. And you have people who think very short term because they have already discounted the fact that the country doesn't stand a chance to make it. And therefore, what matters is the maximization of profits and then moving the profits away from the system. Because like that, first, they maximize the profits, second, they secure them, and third, they are still in power. And this phenomenal increase in inequalities that Lydia described so well has led the system to having an elite that concentrates most of the power and most of the wealth at the same time without having the checks and balances system that will kick them out of the elite circle if there is wrongdoing or if there is failure. Therefore, to answer your question very briefly, no, in the current political structure, it is totally impossible to envisage that the fiscal system is going to evolve in the right way. We are witnessing in front of us basically an operation of, how could we call it? We are stealing the wealth of the Lebanese at a very high speed. We are stealing deposits, and there is absolutely nothing that has been done to stop this process. I quickly referred to the capital controls earlier on. Do we even imagine that it's been more than, let's say, 15 or 16 months that the Lebanese do not have access to what used to be their deposits in the banks, and that until now, nothing was done to organize all of this in order to keep, enough leverage for the most powerful, to avoid taking the same kind of risks, to avoid carrying losses, while everybody else in this society is being hurt like you cannot imagine the amount of harm that is being inflicted. So to me, it's a final no. In two words, the general income tax point, which was raised, is an interesting one, and this tells you how much the system is reluctant to that kind of change. Under George Karim, when he was minister in 2000, we had a draft. In 2004, I had a new draft approved by Minister Ilyas Saba that went to the cabinet, that was sent to parliament, and that was immediately withdrawn by the cabinet afterwards. And this tells you how difficult it is to move onward. Let me tell you one thing. VAT wouldn't even have been voted if the system didn't feel at that time that it was in a very difficult situation and that everything could collapse on everybody's heads. Quickly on the second point, to imagine a less regressive system with more tax money being collected, it doesn't mean at all for the time being that it's going to hurt growth. In my personal opinion, it may even be a very positive point for growth. Growth, as Karim said earlier on in a different way, requires trust in the system. It requires that people feel that they can achieve profits and they would pay their shares. Nowadays, we are in a system where, as I said earlier, competitiveness is biased. People are not being treated on equal ground because the state of law, of course, is far from being close to the Lebanese system nowadays. And finally, because those who are able to mobilize, those from whom we are able to mobilize much more taxes are people who do not contribute a lot in the system. Basically, we're talking about money that is deposited abroad. We're talking about residents who are living on rent money and so on. So yes, of course, plenty can be done on a very clear path without harming the very badly needed growth in the coming years.
Thank you, Alain. So Lydia, would you agree that we can have our cake and eat it too? We can have fairness and growth?
Yes. So no, yeah, I completely agree with Alain Bifani that I think there is no trade-off, and we both have a system that is unfair and that is highly inefficient. Like we all agree, and it was really clear from the talk, and that now the priority is to make it more fair, and that will lead to more efficiency. Now, like the system is completely collapsing. And what is kind of interesting to recall is that the apparent trade-off between fairness and efficiency recently has been criticized a lot by research, and in particular at the World Inequality Lab where I am, we have shown that that basically most of the income growth that happened since the 80s was captured by the top 1%. So in other words, that the supposed trickle-down theory according to which, okay, when there is inequality, actually, okay, the rich get richer, but everyone benefits from it, even people at the bottom, is not that true. On average, like the richest keep most of the growth for themselves. And this is particularly true for Lebanon. So there is no trade-off here. We really need to focus on increasing fairness, and that will increase efficiency. And yeah.
Thank you. Karim. You're on mute, Karim. You need to unmute. Karim, you need to unmute.
Sorry,
okay.
I told you that I will not be long because either Alain or Lydia has have provided you with most of my ideas, and I fully adhere to their thoughts and views. Let me say concerning the first question about the system, the viability of the current system. I may say that, and I am repeatedly telling the same thing since several months. I am saying that when you have a company that is bankrupted, do you appoint the trustee in bankruptcy as the new director of the company? This is our problem here in Lebanon. Everything is bankrupted. The state is bankrupted. The banks are bankrupted, and we even do not apply the rules and the laws. And Alain knows that we have laws. We have two laws, important laws concerning the banking sector. It's not only a matter of capital control. We have the law on the bankruptcy, the law 28, and we have the law on putting the hand on, I don't know if it's, we translate it like that, what aliyat, putting the hand on the banks, the law number 110. And this is perfectly what should apply now to the banking sector, or most of the banks, not all of the banks. Why it is important? Because everything will start from this point. When you are going to inquire about what is not going right, and you will lift the bank secrecy, and you will freeze the assets of the person who were in charge of the management of those banks and other important institutions. Those persons will play the role of whistleblower for you in order for them to escape from the sanctions. They will tell you who did what concerning the political class. And at that moment, it will be easy for you to trace the ill-gotten assets abroad. And you will have a matter to prosecute either in Lebanon or abroad, and to tell them on facts, based on facts. Those persons are corrupted persons. They are still in place as rulers, as ministers, as MPs, but you should freeze their assets abroad. And at that moment, the important thing is not only to retrieve the ill-gotten assets. The important thing is to play the name and shame, to go to them, to tell them, leave your posts. Let the Lebanese being managed by competent, clean persons that will proceed. And this is the answer to the second question. You will, when you change all the person in charge and in post, you will provide the citizens with this important thing that is the trust. You will provide them with the trust, and that at that moment, not only the Lebanese, but also the diaspora. And after the diaspora, the foreign investors, they will invest in Lebanon, and this will provide you, as I have said and highlighted in my presentation, it will provide you with projects, it will create jobs, and this is what will provide you with growth. And at that moment, the thing will change. But without a double pressure, an internal pressure and an international pressure, playing together on equal footing, nothing will be done.
Well, let's keep on this. There are a couple of questions now on the immediate future, on the short term. I mean, the budget deficit is, from the figures, Alain, you put on the table, I calculated quickly, it seems that the primary deficit without the interest may be close to 10% of GDP. This is terribly inflationary. This cannot be sustained. Internally and externally, certainly any IMF program will ask to reduce this, or at least over time. Now, given how regressive things have been, Mirai Khattab just reminds us that the lirification strategy in the banks that you talked about also is excessively regressive. You know, people get a haircut, and the poor and the middle class have to withdraw from their dollar accounts to eat, and they get the larger part of the haircut. So the system is very regressive, as you described it. What can we expect in terms of reaction from this Ministry of Finance that you know so well, Alain? And it's important so that society can start mobilize and then push back against what may come now. And the other part of the question has to do also with what Karim talked about, which is transparency. To what extent can we have more access to data so that citizens understand what's going on and can get organized and resist, including Karim in your ALDIC, which is the Association of Taxpayers. And I might say, parenthesis, Jamil Mawad asks, how come Lydia got all this data? Can he get it too? Can it be made transparent? Can this law on transparency, on freedom of information, help us all get data? I'll tell Jamil that I got the data too, and this is how I did my work on chronism in Lebanon. But let me go around the table again. Alain, تفضل.
Thank you, Isha. What is happening today? Just to comment on what Mireille has written, is not only a huge regressive tax. It's much more than that. A tax is taken by the state. This is the state's money, which in principle is owned by the whole population. What we are seeing today is a haircut inflicted by private operators on other private individuals. So there is basically shareholders taking money from depositors. This is way worse than having a regressive tax. It is actually a crime, and this is why I was referring to the importance of capital controls and the importance of a bank resolution law. In this terribly inflationary environment, as you put it, Isha, what is of essence is precisely time. And I want to emphasize again what I already said many times, and I'm sorry to repeat it. Time is of essence, and by doing nothing during all of this time, we are actually implementing the alternative plan to the government plan. And this plan is very simply, do nothing, wait until the medium and small depositors lose most of their money through haircuts that are not announced. Wait until the fall of the pound takes most of the income of the Lebanese. And at that point in time, we will be able to say that basically, you see, we absorbed most of the losses on certain balance sheets. And we will reach a new normal. But this new normal will bring Lebanon to something totally different. Yes, there will be a balance, but the balance will be reached at levels that we can see in Yemen, for instance. And for those who pretend that they don't want to change the face of Lebanon, this is exactly what should be avoided. And by the way, the reason why I'm saying that time is of essence is that the amount of things that need to happen very, very quickly is enormous. On one hand, we have structural reforms that need to happen immediately. We have the tax system that need to be changed. We have a lot on the fiscal. We have the restructuring of the banking sector. We have the restructuring of the central bank. We have everything that we need for the growth agenda, and so on and so forth. And of course, we have to reestablish the financing of this economy, the channels of financing. And to be able to do that, of course, well, as you put it, yes, the Ministry of Finance that I know well has a lot on its plate. And very simply, if I take it only from the fiscal, there is a need for a complete new budget that has absolutely nothing to do with those exercises that we voted in a shameful manner in the past 2 years. Second, there is a need to revisit the whole structure of expenditure in the Lebanese system. What are we paying for? Those political expenditure have to stop. You know, it's one thing to talk about fighting corruption. It's something else to recruit 10,000 people where you need 100. It is something else to recruit someone at 10 times the normal price on the market, and so on. On the revenue, well, I'm not going to come back to revenue. We've been talking a lot about what can happen. But there are also, on top of the fiscal issues, plenty of other issues that need to be taken care of, obviously, among others, by the Ministry of Finance. And I don't want to repeat myself, but there is a need for social safety nets. There is a need to, we have to.
So this is clear. I wanted to push you more on the nightmare fiscal scenario.
Oh, yes.
That is, what is the equivalent of lyrification on the fiscal? If it's badly adjusted, what can we expect?
Well, during my press conference when I resigned, I mentioned very clearly that the lyrification, the way it was happening, or it was meant to happen, was to be avoided at any rate. What we will probably see is that if nothing happens on the public finance, is that we will continue to see a significant drop in revenue that is going to increase one day at a time, because of the drop in growth, because of the deteriorating situation of the higher unemployment and so on. Whereas the stiffness of expenditure will continue to weigh. Now, of course, one may argue that it's going to go with inflation. Yes, but at the same time, revenue and expenditure are in the same currency. And nowadays, we are benefiting from the fact that we have stopped the payments on the Eurobonds and that we are paying less on the Treasury bills. If the lobby that doesn't want to restructure the domestic debt wins, and if the Eurobond holders start action again, we are going to see a surge in expenditure once again, let alone what will probably happen with the public services and the quality that they are providing, and the very likely need to increase the transfers in those areas. So yes, the nightmare scenario is very close.
Right. So we could expect, in the worst case scenario, really to stay with a deficit, with inflation, with low real wages.
And the deficit that could reach 12 to 13% of GDP very quickly.
Okay, well, this is a pretty pessimistic note to close. Lydia and Karim, I'll ask you to say a couple of minutes each to close the meeting, your closing thoughts. Thank you, Alain.
Should I start? Yes. No, so first, the thing I would like to say is that obviously fiscal policies can really help, our key tool to increase fairness and also to rebuild a state that has means to do social policies. But I'm really pessimistic in this way. I really follow what Alain Bifani just said. I mean, we all seem to agree today, and that's actually a bad sign. That I would like to say that the entire political economy, and I don't have another word, it's colloquial, but it's completely rotten. So, and fiscal policy alone will not help. So you have, I mean, you all know here, you have a system, a consortial democracy enabled the formation of a party cartel. So you have sectarian parties and elites in power that are completely ideologically opposed and stay in power thanks to this sectarian-based mode of governance. And this completely prevents any cohesive policies to be put in place and to have the common good in mind, which destroys the states. And at the same time, without any states, with no fiscal capacity, etc., they can maintain the support for their own sects. And they only agree on one thing, on how to stay and maintain the status quo and prevent any political competition. So we didn't speak about sectarianism, but this is really one key aspect. And at the same time, and here it's Ishaq, the specialist, you have mechanisms that are independent from sectarianism, but really due to modern capitalism with a crony system. So you have the politician that managed to establish alliance and pass a set of laws to fiscal, like beneficial fiscal laws that we talked a lot about, the bank secrecy that Karim talked a lot about. They shared between themselves the public and private sector, and you have both these economic and political mechanisms that feed each other and explain why now inequality are that high. The state is destroyed, and they basically feed themselves and killed the economy and got richer and richer. So I'm a bit pessimistic because they have no reason to stop this mechanism, except that if there is nothing that they can eat and exploit at some point, like that is the only thing. Do we need to go until destruction so that something changes? So really, it should be an entire political reforms, and this I don't have the answer on what form the transition should take, but we need to modify this system to be able after to speak about these fiscal policies and economic reforms.
Thank you. Karim, in shaping your answer, there are two questions that just fell, and maybe you can say a word or two on them. One question is BDL audit. Can it happen as long as the bank secrecy laws are there, or is this a precondition? There's a question on fund repatriation, but that's a big one. We probably need a webinar with that. For that, maybe you could simply say whether you think that anything in the best of circumstances can be recaptured in the short term, or whether this should be thought more of something to start today and to bring fruits later. What is your appreciation?
Yes, let me tell you first, Isha, that I always keen to conclude with a message of hope. And I think that every Lebanese citizen is in a need now to believe in something to continue. And we should be realistic, yes. And despite all those things that we have talked about, there are still many things that may give us a reason to believe that the things may change or will change. And about the forensic audit, this is a very important start. I will not say that it is the conclusion of everything. It is just a start. Why it start? Because the forensic audit may help us. I'm not considering that we will reach results because there are several constraints and impediments in the past encountering our action. But the forensic audit may provide us with elements, with clues, with material that will enable us to pursue the criminals, to pursue the wrongdoing, to pursue everything that happened. And now we have in front of us a very strong lobby of politicians, of financials, of persons in the medias, of businessmen who do not want to create a change in the current situation. Why? Because they know that at the time in the past they did something, and when this thing will be disclosed, they will be asked to give at least explanation, or that it will appear. And this is why nobody wants the bank secrecy to be lifted. Concerning the forensic audit, how can we say today that the bank secrecy protects the public funds? The public funds should not be protected by any bank secrecy. It is the least. And if it was not the case, the Article 7 of the bank secrecy law would not say that the bank secrecy is not sustainable and may not be raised if ever the courts are inquiring about the illicit enrichments. And when we talk about illicit enrichments, we are talking about public funds. The principle is that we may inquire and we may proceed to any audit of the public funds in order to protect the interest of the citizens. When we talk about bank secrecy, it's more professional secrecy, protecting the persons, the accounts. If ever, everything is, they have nothing to hide, because if they have something to hide at that moment, they would not be protected, and we know. And this is why they are trying to challenge the action of the government, and to consider that the forensic audit will be stopped by the bank secrecy, because they don't want the forensic audit to reach a positive conclusion. And this is why we should continue to defend the law, and to defend the objective that has been set at the beginning of the movement of October 17th, striving to reach transparency, to reach integrity, to reach to fight corruption, and to change the mode of the governance in Lebanon.
Thank you, Karim, for helping us to conclude with a note of hope. I want to thank...
And let me tell you something to give hope to people. I have witnessed and participated to the last laws that have been enacted at the parliament concerning the illicit enrichment, concerning the bank secrecy, concerning the several other laws. And those laws are very important, and we have a law for the retrieve of ill-gotten assets now. And those laws, from now on, the illicit enrichment is a crime. It was not a crime at the beginning. And you may prosecute the person without, in front of the commission, the National Commission Against Corruption, without paying any amount, and without taking the risk to be prosecuted or to pay penalties. And we will see in the near future that the results of those laws will provide us with hope. Thank you.
Inshallah. We're only 7 minutes over, which is, I think, a good achievement given the complexity of the topic. Look, I can only conclude by saying knowledge empowers, and understanding the problem is the beginning of finding a solution. So I think discussion like this with experts like you can only help get us closer to the goal. So thank you all. Thank you, Arab Reform Initiative, for organizing that, and the partners for participating. And thank you mostly to all the participants that have stayed with us for an hour and a half and more. Hope for the better. We'll continue that series. Goodbye.